Okay, this being the evening on the same night, 10th of April 2026, I'm about to rip through, hopefully, the whole introduction of Gregory Shaw's Theurgy and the Soul and Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. The invitation here is to please go back to episodes 2 and 3 in the series, which give a little bit more of a context for this because I don't want to waste time on it, frankly. I'm saying that essentially uh, the self-destruction of the human species and probably planet Earth is inevitable unless we wake ourselves up, and we have to wake ourselves up. And I'm sort of talking about how to do that with inspiration from Christian theurgy, but also Neoplatonic theurgy in this context, and embodying the state of perfect receptivity that is the paradox at the heart of both traditions. I'm with that by way of preamble. Um, so in the introduction, it sort of talks about the sort of the decline of traditional pagan culture, where essentially there's a way that Christian monks were sort of spreading out quite like torrents across the countryside and ruining the temples, and ruining the countryside itself at one and the same time. And so this is a sort of, despite the pleas of Libanius, it was too late. This is around the fourth century CE, and it's sort of I'm sort of saying that there's something that is deeply a mistake there. And again, this is from the introduction to the text. I'm going to keep continuing with the lines that I felt were relevant. And so what Iamblichus then comes to talk about, um, yeah, so quite the sentiments of Libanius reflect the despair of a culture that only 2 generations earlier had been far more hopeful. When the Roman imperial court first came under the influence of Christianity during the reign of Constantine, the leading thinkers of the pagan world turned to the Syrian Platonist Iamblichus for spiritual and intellectual leadership. And so, as a consequence, we get this Iamblican integral connection between the rituals of cultic worship that were common to paganism and the intellectual disciplines of the philosophic Paideia. And this had been the sort of the goal of Plato himself. And yes, it's a sort of dive into paganism for the moment. It does sort of come back around to, again, like I was saying, the paradox that is a common core. You could say a non-dual core, but that is common to Christianity as well. But for the moment, it's about paganism. And so, yeah, basically what we're going to get is a metaphysics that gives a positive view of matter and of embodiment, and that talks about, a hierarchy of the gods, specifically as a kind of culmination of Plato's vision. Um, yeah, with specific religious praxis in mind. And so the central issue of Iamblichus's age wasn't this polemic between pagans and Christians, but a far more serious conflict between old ways and new ways, between ancient traditions inspired by the gods and those recently invented by man. Yeah, so this is sort of the difference between, hey, it's the solution that we're looking for is not something that can be designed. We cannot create or design our way out of this problem. It's humanity's attempt to engineer solutions that keeps getting us into the meta crisis, essentially. And so the difference is that when we sort of try to engineer our way out of these problems that are hitting us at a spiritual or religious level, as in we need new cultural technologies in order to facilitate our waking up process, but we can't exactly design that. It's more about facilitating, or yeah, providing the appropriate context for whatever wants to emerge. Uh, Spiritual midwifery. Yeah, and so this sort of showed up again in his time as this distinction between old ways and new ways, where he sort of talked about ancient traditions inspired by the gods and those that were more recently invented by man. We can sort of see alchemy in the same light, but that's for a different video. So I'm going to continue here. So Iamblichus felt responsible to preserve our contact with the gods, and so his concern wasn't with Christians or any group. Um, it was more that we should retain our contact with the gods by any means, in a sense. Like it's not about that other people were like the villains. It was about, hey, can we actually commune with the divine or not? He sort of thought that there was a sort of excessive rationalism in Platonic schools, which I certainly see everywhere around me. And yeah, that sort of exalts the power of the mind while diminishing the prestige of what he calls the traditional cults of the gods. that in his view were the basis for all genuine culture and wisdom. It's not so much about that. It's about genuine like religious participation and embodiment and enacting religious worship, not just talking about it, right? And there may be specific ways to do that that are relevant. Yeah, so theurgia or God work was at the heart of Iamblichus' vision for the Platonic disciplines. He preferred it to theologia, theurgia versus theologia, which is God talk. Um, so talking about God, although I think we can see how that can, like our dialogue, right? Dialogical practices can very much be relevant and involved, but also take us away from the power of the imagination and the importance of uh, communal forms of worship and, frankly, singing and dancing, as well as the power of sacraments. It's not just about talking, for goodness sake. Ironic as that may be to hear. We talked about theologia as tied to sort of the invocation of natural powers of the cosmos. So there's a way that theologia can be applied to theurgia or is involved with theurgia. I'm thinking of, for example, the Icaros, the songs of the shamans from the Amazon. It's like that. Yes, they speak, they chant, their talking is involved, but it's not exactly there on its own, right? Iamblichus believed that the world described by Plato in the Timaeus has been torn apart by a new kind of Platonism that denied the sanctity of the world and that elevated the human mind beyond its natural limits. So, according to Iamblichus, that kind of rationalistic hubris was threatening to separate us from the activity of the gods, and theurgy was essentially the antidote to restore our access to the divine order. Theo he talked about how theology was merely a logos, a discourse about the gods, but theurgy was a theon ergon. I'm not sure how to pronounce the ancient Greek here, but it's a work of the gods capable of transforming man to a divine status. It's not just talking about it. Um, I think again, this is also a false dichotomy that I'm trying to point to with stuff involving uh, sacrament and the power of the imagination and like that. But I'll just sort of leave that there and we'll continue here. He provided a sort of philosophic rationale for the performance of religious rites and rituals, and ensured that, yeah, that's enough there. So he's sort of saying that um, these acts of, yeah, cultic worship, like religious practice and philosophic paideia, as in our philosophy about what we're trying to educate and inculcate within people. Uh, like in the academy, they were doing like logic and rhetoric and philosophy and so on. What else were they doing? Well, they should also be doing theurgy, is the whole point. So we're talking about that these different strands of it, like religious praxis and also uh, a philosophic paideia and a pedagogy, they're rooted in one source, which is the ineffable power of the gods, blah blah. And yeah, in theurgy, these divine principles are embodied and enacted. We could also say embedded and extended, not merely contemplated. And although I'm not denying the importance of contemplation, I'll keep going here. We're just sort of this is more of an outline of where Iamblichus is coming from. He's sort of saying that uh yeah, his concern was with Plato's description of the cosmos and its role in the education and deification of the soul. So it's talking about Plato's cosmocentric vision rather than the anthropocentric vision of Christianity. Although, again, I'm not denying the importance of that particular tradition. I explored that in some detail last time. So we're sort of talking about a new model for education and religious practice tied together that has to do with, again, the education and deification of the soul. So soul development. I mean, go look at Bill Plotkin, for example, Nature and the Human Soul, among other works. Yeah, it was. So we're talking about the issue of the soul's place in this cosmos, the sensible world. What are we doing here? What are we doing here? And his answer to that question was sort of quite different uh, from non-theurgical Platonists like Plotinus and Porphyry. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about the differences with other philosophers. We're sort of trying to get on with it a bit. He sort of, Iamblichus, this is established a new synthesis of cult and philosophy and sort of become the first leader of a Platonic school to function simultaneously as a hierophant of a sacred cult, which is quite impressive. Um, yeah, we'll keep going there. He sort of I'm skipping quite a lot there, and that's I don't feel is important. Yeah, he gives sort of what would you say? He thinks that the sort of Egyptian mysteries were like really important and influential, and sort of believed that Pythagoras had been trained a lot with the Egyptians. And he's a sort of big Pythagorean Iamblichus, so that's kind of important. So you're sort of saying that many different cultures can be theurgic. It's not about one culture being better than another or whatever. It's like about do they actually practically enable us to commune with the gods or not, roughly speaking. Yep, and so one of his key texts is sort of like this dialogue between himself and Porphyry, where he sort of takes the role as an Egyptian mystagogue, responding to the questions and criticisms of Porphyry as a philosopher. This is also sort of also in the vein of Peter Kingsley that I also won't go on about. He sort of what he believes is that it's necessary for the soul to inhabit its proper place in the cosmos, and that we have to sort of fully descend into these lives, these bodies, these identities. Incarnation, in a word. This is sort of in contrast to Plotinus and Porphyry. This gets a bit interesting. Following Plato's laws, quote, Plato says that in man's golden age, humanity was ruled by a divine hierarchy that ensured the well-being of all. The god Kronos established religion and political law, and society was governed by daemons. Um, quote, Kronos gave our, this is Plato, Kronos gave our communities as their kings and rulers. Again, society was governed by daemons, but Kronos gave our communities as their kings and rulers. Not men, but daemons. Beings of diviner and superior kind, just as we still do the same with our flocks of sheep and herds of other domesticated animals. We do not set oxen to manage oxen or goats to manage goats. We, their betters in kind, act as masters ourselves. So the god, in his kindness to man, did the same. He set over us the superior race of daemons. So this is like the Platonic conception of the cosmos in terms of daemons. There are these like, you could say, yeah, I mean, you have to just sort of say spiritual beings, but it's like this is what daimons are, and that they're sort of we're sort of talking about the spirit of a community. Like in Athens, it was Athena. It's this kind of thing. And there's a distinction between daimons and gods, which we're going to go into in some detail. But what we're talking about here through Plato's laws, again, is that um, if I quote the full section here, it's guided by these daemons. Man enjoyed peace, prosperity, and justice until he usurped their authority and began to rule himself and ignored the hierarchical law that each species must obey its superior order. In accord with this principle, Plato believed that humanity should seek to re-establish the order and hierarchy of the Golden Age. And this seems quite reasonable in you know in terms of the spiritual hierarchy that is apparent to many people through Christianity and other traditions, that it's only the modern West that has sort of fallen out of this and tried to essentially take the place of the master when it ought to be the emissary, to draw from McGilchrist for a minute. Yeah, and so the myth that we were just talking about reveals Plato's model for a cosmic and social order. It's again cosmogenesis. It's a way that the cosmos should be ordered. It describes a taxonomy in which the gods stand as the principle and basis for human society that literally hold our tribes together and are in relationship between the tribes. So what we're talking about is that we're talking about an intertribal network, yes, out of the cities and toward the tribes, and hopefully they cannot be in tribal warfare because there can be a community of daemons or other divine beings, which we will talk about. Quote, acting as intermediaries between the gods and man, daemons revealed the rhythms of the year through which human society contacted the gods in ritual and sacrifice, and thus became properly placed within the unity of the cosmos. This is what we've forgotten in large part, although we already had a lot of that going, right? And we're still in the meta crisis that we're in. So yes, we need a lot of that back, but we're also talking about waking ourselves up, which is in the same direction, but it's not entirely the same. So we need to get specific. Plato observes that for a city to be kept alive, its sacrifices and feasts must fit the true natural order. So I'm sort of coming from this point of view that like cities are inherently unsustainable, unsustainable and unstable, and that we sort of believe that we could live in groups of people larger than the Dunbar number for about 150 people, and basically we can't, and we need to go again. This is retribalization, but then like sort of once we've recognized that, it's not about maintaining cities, it's about going back to tribes, and then it's about the uh, relationship between the different tribes in terms of a spiritual community or divine hierarchy, which is the kind of fulfillment of, in this context, Neoplatonic theurgy, but essentially the cosmocentric vision that Plato had, as expressed through Iamblichus. He thought that this Plato, that this coordination of human acts to the cosmos increases the intelligence of men. Again, it's not just intelligence, it's also wisdom, and it's also not just wisdom, but it's consciousness. As in, there are particular activities, particular actions that we can take, particular forms of worship, practice, religious practice, that can actually make us more aware, that can actually make us more conscious, in a sense. Well, we need that, do we not? More than anything. And I'm not just talking about consciousness. I'm also talking about the there's a I think an inherent connection there between consciousness and the good and agency. Although you want to be careful not to sort of assume all of that. You can see that I'm sort of already halfway through the introduction, so I'm going to keep going here. I'll leave that there. He sort of again um the goal of Plato's sort of educational paideia was measured by the soul's capacity uh to assimilate to the gods. And to do that, one has to enter into communion with daemons who reveal themselves in the natural world. I'm going to say that again. So there's a way that, according to Plato, as I'm understanding here, the goal of this sort of educational paideia that was his, in a sense, what he had to share with us, the goal of that was measured by the soul's capacity to be assimilated to the gods. So again, we're talking about a philosophy and a pedagogy and religious praxis that involves communion with the gods, the development of the soul, through the development of the soul. And the success of that, let's say, program or way of life can be measured, but although it can't be measured, right? As in, it can't be empirically measured, but we could talk about it in terms of the soul's capacity to assimilate to the gods. And in order to do that, one has to practice entering into communion with and through the daemons, the gods. But it's these daemons who apparently reveal themselves in the natural world that are going to be important to us. And we're going to go into the distinction between daemons and gods and in some detail. I'm doing my best to understand what is quite a difficult and in some ways completely different philosophy. Yeah, and so we're sort of talking about the Platonic worldview here, and he sort of talks about the sort of discussion of a locative view of existence, which centers around I'm just going to briefly go through this before I move on here. That there's five key propositions that sort of inform this worldview that give rise to its the coherence of this worldview. Quote, one, there's a cosmic order that permeates every level of reality. That doesn't really add much for me, but yeah, this cosmic order is the divine society of the gods. Three, the structure and dynamics of that society of the gods can be discerned in the movements and patterned juxtapositions of the heavenly bodies. Four, human society should be the microcosm of the divine society. And five, the chief responsibility of priests and kings is to attune human order to the divine world. Quote, in this quote, locative orientation to the cosmos, evil and the demonic arise only when something is out of place. When something inverts or is turned upside down or alienated from the whole, it then manifests as evil. And so in this way, the Platonic Paideia was supposed to reorient the soul to the cosmic or locative order and to exorcise it of its self-assertion. So in this Platonic view, the demonic is a symptom of the soul's confusion. Yeah, so as since the Platonic taxonomy is also monistic, this the element of the demonic is only relatively evil, as kind of unbalanced expression of divine elements. And so there's a kind of prioritizing here of harmony and order and sort of bringing things back into a line with the gods, which I think has some traction, but I think there's also a sort of what Alan once called the element of irreducible rascality, chaos, in a word, the archetype of the mother that sort of messes with this dynamics of messes with our harmonics, spiritual harmonics at quite deep levels. I won't go on about that either. I'm just sort of saying I think there is something reasonable to draw from, certainly in contrast to everything that we've had for the past 500, 600 years or something. I'll just sort of leave all of that there about Plato's cosmology and I'll move on a bit. Again, we're sort of talking about the reorientation of the soul toward that cosmic order, and that this, in a way, brings our human society into alignment with the society of the gods, which is sort of the right thing to do in a sense. Yeah, and so just to clarify that the term demonic, which was used there quite a bit, sort of expresses like disorientation from that or disharmony within that scheme. And it represents, yeah, chaos, disorder, and evil, in a short, that which threatens the cosmos. It's not to be confused with daemonism in traditional Platonism. Quote, the Platonic daemon was a cosmogonic entity and certainly not evil, although there were dualist interpretations that led those terms to be conflated. We're sort of trying to disentangle that here. But I'm going to continue. Yeah, there's a sort of there's a contrast here where this was then sort of destroyed, right? There's a sort of there came about a pervasive acosmic mood of late antiquity, which affected a deep change in this locative orientation, like a change in this sacred canopy that was protecting us and influencing us. The all-pervasive and beneficent order of a cosmos, articulated in its most sophisticated form by Plato and less subtly by others, was transformed into a maleficent system of repression and punishment meted out by cruel demons. Blah blah blah. And so, at that time, this is the sort of the Gnostic turn, in a sense, where our salvation is no longer measured by the degree of our assimilation to the patterns of the cosmos, but rather by the degree to which we can escape those patterns. And Iamblichus' position was developed in that context, namely that he was an inheritor of Platonian Platonism, um, where in Plotinus's view, the soul never descends into a body; it remains in the heavens, above the flesh and blood world. Whereas Iamblichus thinks that the soul does fully embody and incarnate in, again, these lives, these bodies, these identities, and that is essential to theurgic communion with the gods. I'm going to keep going here. In contrast to the Gnostics, they identify the cosmos as evil and the soul as a fallen spirit. Um, Plotinus denies the soul's descent and identifies sensible matter as evil and the cause of the soul's confusion. Both of those projects seem to concur that the traditional Platonic taxonomy was no longer valid, but because both of them project the demonic outside the soul. So for Gnostics, the soul was pure, but polluted by material daemons. And for Plotinus, the soul never descends to this world at all. Yeah. And so yeah, and so yeah, Plotinus, just as much as the Gnostic, sort of rejects the Platonic locative taxonomy that I was just talking about. And there's a way that by placing the demonic outside the soul, in association with nature. So it's nature which becomes demonic, right? And by denying the soul's descent, Plotinus sort of reversed Platonic taxonomy. Quote, whereas traditional Platonic Paideia had traced an ascent to the gods through a deepening assimilation to cosmic orders, Plotinus's utopian orientation tended to devalue the cosmos as a divine revelation. This, in turn, denied the value of religious rituals tied to the rhythms of the sensible world. That all seems quite straightforward to me, so I'm going to continue here. So Iamblichus's point of view sort of developed in the context of all this Gnosticism and Plotinus. And so his doctrine that the soul does completely descend into mortality, as I was talking about in quite some detail last time, um, is not just an intellectual justification for theurgy, it's also more than that. Because there are central issues here. Part of them is that, yeah, this doctrine that the soul does not fully descend um, sort of strikes to the heart of the Platonic Paideia because it sort of threatens to desacralize and demonize the cosmos. So it really matters, according to people like Iamblichus. Like, can our souls be fully present in these lives, these bodies, this reality, right? And Iamblichus thinks yes, and he thinks it's crucially important that we believe this and in fact embody that. In fact, that it's by way of it's by way of matter, by way of embodiment that we can in fact commune with the divine in a term. Whereas, quote, if, as Plotinus believes, the soul's confusion does not derive from the body, if the soul does not undergo a complete change in embodiment, and if it does not, in fact, truly become embodied, then the manifestation of the divine as cosmos would have little or no role in the soul's paideia. Yeah, and so in effect, this doctrine of the undescended soul sort of split the cosmos into two opposed worlds. And if the physical world was upside down and not the soul, then the performance of sacrifices and rituals to assimilate oneself to its orders would be worse than useless. They would be positively harmful. Yeah, so in Plotinus's vision, the physical world is basically inverted and is a kind of it's a corrupting influence on the soul, which is pure in some way. And Gnosticism, sorry, to clarify, in Gnosticism, the soul is pure but polluted by material demons. And for Plotinus, the soul never descends into these bodies fully at all. And this is a problem. And so there's a way that this is a way of conceiving as the physical world as upside down, whereas in Iamblican theurgy and I think Platonic and Neoplatonic theurgy of these varieties that I'm trying to talk about, the soul is inverted. So by virtue of being incarnated in these lives, these bodies, these identities, we invert ourselves in some way. This had to do with what I described last time as the inherent qualities of our human identity as connected to our mortality and our limits and our foibles and our self-alienation as well. We are alienated deeply from who we are. I'm getting back to it. Yeah, it's that our essence is divided. Our immortality becomes mortal, and our identity becomes a form of self-alienation. This is inherent to who we are. This is what Iamblichus is talking about. And so I just want to talk briefly through the remaining 6 pages of the introduction. So we talked about this doctrine of the undescended soul that we see through Plotinus. And this doctrine, which Iamblichus is sort of fighting against, had significant social consequences. So, for example, if the traditional agricultural and civic religious festivals were tied to nature's powers, then to take part in them would be to commit oneself to the demonic order. So it's like no wonder that the Plotinian school should sort of destroy all those traditional agricultural religious rites and festivals and so on. Gregory Shaw then talks in some detail about how in the traditional Platonic Paideia, there's like one stage of the soul's development is never opposed to another stage. And so there's a way that this Paideia is conceived by Plato as a hierarchical unfolding of the powers of the soul through a corresponding enfolding of the soul into the harmonies and powers of the cosmos, which we're then trying to explore like how and practically to do that in a through Iamblichus's theurgical vision. So there's a way that, yeah, higher degrees of this paideia include the lower degrees, just as the primary orders of the cosmos contain the subordinate orders. But when the cosmos is desacralized, that paradigm is then lost. And so there's a way that Plotinus's doctrine of the undescended soul severs the body from its head. Yep, and yeah, Plotinus's position was also expressed through Porphyry, who was his disciple, and then comes about this sort of deep disagreement between Porphyry and Iamblichus, which Iamblichus writes about in great detail. Yeah, so for Porphyry, sort of the in a way that sort of aligns with Christianity, Porphyry sort of attributes the origins of pagan religious rites to the devices of bloodthirsty daemons whose life depended on ingesting the vapors of blood sacrifice, which does seem pretty horrible. Quote, falsehood is allied to these malevolent beings, for they want to be considered as gods, and the power which presides over them is ambitious to appear as the greatest god. They are those, sorry, these are they who rejoice in libations and the savor of sacrifices. Yeah, so there's some sort of careful disentangling that we have to do here. Um, I won't comment any more about that disentangling at this point, other than to say it needs to be done. There's a kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater that Gregory Shaw is sort of pointing out in Porphyry. Sort of because Porphyry sort of ends up advising stuff like, hey, the philosopher should forego all ritual activities in order to return alone through himself to God. And like maybe, but maybe only for the elite. Um, yeah, he's sort of saying that the philosopher is the savior of himself, and I kind of not that I want to deny the archetype of the sage, like I get the importance of that, but yeah, there is something important about rituals and rites that we do seem to have forgotten, and that doesn't mean like to recover that does not entail that we have to go back to blood sacrifices, it seems to me. Okay, so I'm going to continue here through, yeah, what Iamblichus had to say is then that he's sort of, Iamblichus hopes to recover Plato's positive orientation to the cosmos, which seems like a pretty basic, metaphysical point. It's like, hey, that this world is good, is the expression of goodness. Because what's at issue is the divinity of this world. And for Iamblichus, the most effective means to acknowledge that divinity is through the performance of rites that conformed the soul to the orders of the cosmos. Yeah, so whereas for Porphyry, sort of this metaphysics of the undescended soul and the demonized cosmos ends up opposing the philosopher to the sensible world and the social order. Yeah, so for Porphyry, Platonism was limited to an intellectual elite. But for the theurgical Platonism of Iamblichus, this allows for gradations of religious experience that correspond to different levels of the cosmos and society. I could just sort of invoke Viveki and leave it at that, but I think there's more work to be done at this point from 27-year-olds, you know. Quote, Iamblichus, like Plato, placed the demonic entirely within the embodied soul. So it's for in Platonism, the demonic is not external to the soul or on the fridge of the cosmos. It's like central in a way that so we have to deal with it. Um, yeah, so it's the demonic within the embodied soul is the only chaos which is untamed by the demiurge. This is comporting beautifully with Jung that we are the origin of all coming evil. We have to look within ourselves, right? However, in Iamblichus's Platonism, the purpose of our alienation from ourselves is made clearer. While Plato's demiurge gave to each soul a spark of himself, Iamblichus understood this to mean that each soul had a responsibility to perform its own demiurgy, that is to say, its own theurgy. The task for every soul was to partake in divine mimesis by creating a cosmos out of the initial chaos of its embodiment. Again, the task for every soul is to partake in divine mimesis by creating a cosmos out of the initial chaos of its embodiment. So it's a way of taking the mud, which is our life, and allowing a lotus to grow through that mud such that the Buddha might sit on the flower which unfolds from the lotus. Yeah, therefore, the demonic condition of the embodied soul was a felix culpa, without which the soul could not participate in cosmogenesis. Again, without which the soul could not participate in cosmogenesis, including its own creation and salvation. Yep. And only a little bit more to go. So just to say that, like Plato, Iamblichus believed that his age was threatened by the loss of the gods, and he yearned for a time when gods and men would be concretely joined through ritual. So in his theurgical Platonism, Iamblichus tries to recapture this kind of golden age, and he sort of only succeeded within Platonic circles. But his Syrian school represents probably the best synthesis of philosophy and ritual in the late antique world. Moving on a little, yeah. So what we're going to get at here is issues of central importance to the theurgy and its associative philosophy of, as expressed by 4th century Platonists, the status of matter and the material world, the nature of the embodied soul, and the way to achieve salvation. That's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah. So using, using Neo-Pythagorean theories, which he presented as the old ways of the Egyptians, Iamblichus argued that matter derived from a divine principle and that the physical cosmos was directly generated by the gods. Yeah, so it's a positive vision of matter and of the embodied soul and of the way to achieve salvation through religious practice. What he's saying moreover is that since Iamblichus believed that the soul fully descended and was paradoxically both mortal and immortal, he had to create a soteriological practice, means of salvation, that incorporated the soul's physical actions into a divine pattern, the specific function of theurgic rites, which we might look at in specific detail. Quote, in short, theurgy was Iamblichus's attempt to ensure the deification of souls through their assimilation to the orders of the cosmos, which is a traditional Platonic teaching. Okay, and I'm going to explore the first part of Gregory Shaw's 2014 second edition of Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus, with his first section, Matter and Embodiment, embodiment in the Platonic tradition, which I will come back to.